Hi guys, good morning! Nandito kami sa road today and samahan nyo kami pupunta sa Chicago City today. Mamasyal lang tayo sandali kasi Labor Day, walang work dito. Pero, I don't know. Others, I think they have work tomorrow. So, pasyal tayo sa Chicago guys. Bantayan mo kami Lord kasi mag-travel kami ng 1 hour? Yeah, 1 hour. Going to Chicago City from our place, guys. Kasi nandito kami sa suburb west Chicago. So, let's go, guys! See you in Chicago City. Ayan, nandito na tayo sa Chicago, guys. Entering Chicago City. Ayan, guys. We are entering Chicago City.
Chicago Stock Exchange.
Ganda dito guys sa Chicago. Ayan o, ganda ng mga buildings. City life. This is city life.
Reggie Watts has a song.
You know what, like,
Ano ko like it? Ayan guys, malapit na tayo sa river. Doon tayo pupunta. Sasakay tayo ng boat cruise. Wow! Ano wala to din? Yeah.
都已经排队了。
哦，see？所以好多人。
他们有好多位。
Ayan guys, sasakay tayo ng boat cruise. Water taxi. Before so we use shoreline.
Before the shoreline,
It's a shoreline.
they are also architect.
Alright, cool, man. Cool, yeah, we're gonna get y'all on a little bit.
4:45, but everything else.
What? What? Ang haba ng pila guys.
这个如果我们2个人开雅艇呢，可以。
哦，好累哦，那个
Cut user?
咱马上卡的这
Oh
个。
yeah, table cut 好厉害，table 好细。
那我们可以下来的。
那我们怎么回来？现在是可以 rental 了，我们也可以 rental， 我们也会开车船啊，我们下次也 rental 一个 boat。突然觉得他的很好。
艾丽嘎菜的时候，我们可以 rent 一个。She will be the driver. 哦 ，shoreline 好多，你看。刚刚这个那么慢 ，Wandela。
这个的 run 是 run the boat。
Yeah.
那是 OK， 看看 view 也好，对不对吧？来这边。
That's your purpose, huh?
这不是我的 purpose， 他跑自己走过来，自己跑出来了。这个行业，这个。
The river gets cleaner and cleaner the more people come down and visit, and that just keeps getting better and better. And guess what? All of you are some of those people, right? So we're glad to have you down on the river here today. Now over here on our left, another example of a building covered in reflective glass. Look at how the neighbors across the way appear to sail across the surface of the building. Look at how it gives the surreal impression as though you're looking straight through the building into the sky beyond it. It's part of the reason why architects love this reflective glass so much. Every time you see a building like that, it's going to look different depending on the environmental envelope. So we'll see more examples of that as we continue on the tour. The next building we're going to take a look at is an example of how architects in Chicago respect their architectural heritage. Over here on the left is the Builders Building. It's this building that changes about 3/4 of the way down. That's because the front of the building is from the 1920s, and then that annex and the roof were added in the 1980s. Take a look at the section from the 80s. You'll see it's built with modern materials and a modern technique, but as we get closer and closer to it, compare and contrast the two different sections. You'll start to realize that that newer section, though it doesn't exactly copy what's come before, it is inspired by the older section of the building. It still respects its architectural heritage. Take a closer look at the Builders Building as we come out from underneath the bridge. Once you're done looking at the Builders Building, we're going to cut across the river and take a look at a style of architecture. I told you woo was the right response, right? There it is. So we're going to take a look at a style of architecture we'll see over and over again on our tour. Let's look at the details first. Soaring vertical lines, setbacks at the top. All of that draws your eyes up the building, making for a very optimistic style of architecture. This is Art Deco. We've got all the wooers out today, guys. I don't know what's going on. We got from 2009, not too long ago. When it comes to architecture, it's also fairly tall. A lot of the taller buildings are newer buildings. As a matter of fact, this is the second tallest building in Chicago. We're going to see the top 3 tallest on our tour here today. And you'll also see these patios up and down the sides of the building. Each of those patios at the heights of some of the other buildings around it. This lowest one at the same height as the building that's behind us, not including the clock tower. That second one at the same height as these towers across the way. That's not by accident, that's by design. The architect here is trying to make the building look good in context with the other buildings around it. So we call that contextualism, and we'll see more examples of that as we continue on our tour. Now, as you look around at all the buildings around us, you can tell they're all from different time frames. So we're going to be jumping all over in time on our tour. We just left 2009. As we head underneath the bridge, we're heading into the groovy 1960s. Over here on the right, you've got 2 towers looking like corn on the cob. These are Marina City from the 1960s. Bertrand Goldberg is the name of the architect here, bit of a social scientist, trying to change the way that people live. You see, back in the 1960s, not a lot of people lived downtown. They'd work here, they'd go home to the suburbs at night. So Bertrand Goldberg builds Marina City as a city within the city. Apartments up above, valet parking down below, but inside the building there are stores, restaurants, fitness. Right? You can live your whole life without ever getting out of your pajamas in a building like that. So very popular for folks to live in urban city centers today in multi-use buildings, but it took architects like Bertrand Goldberg to get people down here. They call it Marina City because there's a place to park your yacht, which was very surprising in the 1960s because this was a pretty polluted waterway back then. Not something you want to spend a lot of time on. That's all changed. If you take a look over here on your left, you can see we've added about a mile of new shoreline to the city with our river walk. Started in the early 2000s. It's a great example of a positive loop. As more folks come down to the river, the more interested they are in keeping the river clean. And as the river gets cooler on every bridge. So anytime you see a building with soaring vertical lines and setbacks at the top, it'll be that Art Deco style. This building is the Merchandise Mart. This is where merchants in Chicago would shop for goods for their stores back in the early 1930s. That Art Deco style from the roaring 20s, late 20s to the early 1930s. Out in front of the building, you'll see there are these pillars with busts of some famous American merchants. Names you might be familiar with: Montgomery Ward, Marshall Field, Woolworth, just to name a few. And if you're able to climb up one of those pillars and you push back real hard on one of those heads, a big hunk of candy comes out of their necks. And that's a Pez joke. I'm glad to see that you're all still paying attention. That's pretty good. So a lot of building here. You took all of the office space inside of there and spread it out to be over 14 football fields of office space. Now, as we head underneath the next bridge, eyes up, cameras out, as we come into one of the most breathtaking parts of our river. Welcome, everyone, to Wolf Point, a 360-degree view of architecture. Most of the buildings you see around here built in just the last few years. Wolf Point's the name of the part of the river where the main branch, was what we're on, meets up with the south and north branches. We're going on all three branches of the river here today, and the river is why Chicago is here. If you head out through the south branch, you can get out to the Mississippi, ultimately out to the Gulf of Mexico in one direction. You head out the other way through the Great Lakes, you can get out to the Atlantic Ocean, New York, and beyond. That makes Chicago the beating heart of the United States. Everything coming in and out from right here in Chicago. Now, straight in front of us where the points of the river meet, this building is called River Point. That makes sense, but because of the parabolic arches at the top and bottom of the building, some folks say it looks like the box your microwave Hot Pocket's in. They call it the Hot Pocket building. That arch, those are all exhaust fans for those train lines. Now, like I told you, most of the buildings around here built in just the last few years. Salesforce Tower on your right, going up right in front of your eyes. They're still working on it. But the next building I'm going to point out to you is the oldest building I have to show you on the river here today. Straight in front of us, you'll see this sort of peachy pink building coming into view. If you don't see it yet, don't worry. It's going to pull up right next to it. This is Fulton House, this building from the 1890s. Originally a cold storage warehouse back when Chicago had the nickname of Hog Butcher to the World. Down on the south side of the city, we had the Union Stockyards. Literally millions of heads of livestock passing through those gates every year. You've heard of the assembly line. This was the disassembly line. Once those animals were processed, they were taken to big refrigeration warehouses like Fulton House, where they were frozen before they were loaded onto refrigerated train cars, taken all across the United States, even around the world. Back in the 1890s, there were people in Germany eating sausages processed right here in Chicago. Now, by the 1970s, the stockyard had come to a close, and so they had to find something else to do with big old buildings like Fulton House. They cut through 3-foot-thick walls to put in those windows and patios, and when they did, they found the 1890s equivalent of insulation: matted horsehair and cork. That project was led by Harry Weiss, an architect in the 1980s. He also designed the quirky little river cottages right next door. Harry was a bit of a sailor, so you can see the nautical themes here. Triangular shapes evocative of sails, circular windows that look like portholes. But people thought Harry was nuts for building on this polluted river back in the 1980s. But architects, they're forward thinking. Harry knew he would get around to cleaning things up, and now that we have, those are multi-million-dollar units down here on the river. So it seems like Harry had a pretty good idea. Here's another example of changing attitudes towards the river. Over on the right is the East Bank Club. This is a high-end fitness center, again, from the 1980s. A lot of famous Chicagoans worked out here. Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, just to name a few. But the building, built in the 1980s when the river was still pretty polluted, so you see we're looking at the back of the building. They're treating the river as an alley to be ignored. However, if you cut across the river to the more recently built multi-million-dollar townhouses, well, now there's a promenade. Every house has its own balcony or two, right? The river's a feature. It's a selling point, not something to turn your back on. Now, this section of the city just north of the main branch of the river, we call it River North. That makes sense, right? This originally was a very industrial city, a lot of factories, a lot of warehouses over here, until about the 1980s, and when the industry started to move out of town. Take a look at the facade. You can see this was originally a warehouse along the river from the 1910s. All that brick on there, right? But then take a look at all the balconies tacked onto the side. So this building is a good example, just like Fulton House, of something called adaptive reuse, right? When you know, a lot of times when they're building a new building, they'll tear down what's there and they'll build something else. Well, if you can keep the building and adapt it and reuse it for something else, not only does it preserve the history of the space, it's also better for the environment as well. So what used to be a warehouse here on the river today, people are living there, and you know that because of those balconies. And if you take a look around River North, you're going to see lots and lots of balconies. Anytime you see a balcony on a building, that tells you people live there, whether it's apartments, condos, or hotels. And everybody wants to live in River North, right? So when you have a lot of people living somewhere, well, you have to give them a place to go and hang out. So over around the right, you're going to see a newly added park from the early 2000s. This is Ward Park, named after a famous company that used to work out of Chicago. If you don't know the company yet, just from Ward Park, maybe this next building will help you out. The one with the white edge on the corner of it, this used to be the corporate headquarters for this company back in the 1970s. Today, again, adaptive reuse, people are living in that building, but they still call it the Montgomery. Well, you put them together, you've got Montgomery Wards, right? Montgomery Ward Catalog Company used to be a big company here in Chicago. For you younger folks, catalogs, they were like Amazon, but on paper. And Aaron Montgomery Ward was the name of the guy who invented Montgomery Wards. And like a lot of these first millionaires at the beginnings of Chicago, he was a self-made man. His first job was working in a factory, making about 25 cents a day. He worked his way up to being a traveling salesman across the Midwest, and he would hear the same complaint from all the farmers. They would talk about how the local stores would overcharge for their goods because there wasn't any competition. So he had an idea. Instead of going door to door, what if he could just send a piece of paper in the mail with a list of everything he sold? He could keep the prices lower that way, and then people would save money. He'd make more money, right? We know that's a great idea with something like Amazon, but on Amazon, you can see reviews of what you're getting. You can see how many stars they've been rated. This is the late 1800s. This is just some guy in Chicago saying, hey, send me some money, I'll send you a tractor by mail. People thought he was nuts. He couldn't get anybody to invest in his company. He started off with about $1,000 of his own money. So he made a promise that no one had ever guaranteed for your money back. Montgomery Ward was the first company to make that promise, and that's all it took for people to give him a chance. And what he discovered is what we all know today: people love to shop from home. That one-page catalog at its height was a 4-pound wish book. That $1,000 that he first invested, Aaron Montgomery Ward was making about $40 million a year when he passed away. Yeah, let's hear it for Aaron Montgomery Ward, right? Now this building here on our right, part of that Montgomery Ward complex, originally office space, soaring vertical lines let you know Art Deco building, balconies tacked onto the side, adaptive reuse. People live in there today. But our story with Aaron Montgomery Ward continues, because once he had made his millions, he opened up an office across the street from what is today Millennium Park. And as he looked out into the parkland, he saw that the city was treating it as a garbage dump. There were horse stables out there, squatter villages, and what he knew was there was a promise made at the founding of the city that our lakefront was to remain free and clear for as long as the city was around. No private property on our lakefront. So with his newly made millions, Aaron Montgomery Ward took the city of Chicago to court to make them clean up their lakefront. He ended up fighting the city for over 20 years, spending around $40 million of his own money. It went all the way up to the Illinois Supreme Court, which ultimately found in his favor. After the trial, reporters asked him what he thought of the verdict. He said, "If I knew in the beginning how much it would cost and how long it would take, I don't know if I would have started. No one appreciates what I've done today. I hope someday that they will, but I doubt it." And the guy passed away not too long after that final court case. So part of the reason why we have over 17 miles of uninterrupted lakefront property here in Chicago is because an angry old guy didn't mess up his front lawn. And that Montgomery Ward complex continues with this huge building that's behind us to our right and left. This was the warehouse space for Montgomery Ward. Whereas we saw the soaring vertical lines on those other buildings, here you'll see very prominent horizontal lines. This style of architecture called the prairie style. The idea being that the building is married to the landscape, the flat plains of the Midwest. The architect most closely associated with this style, Frank Lloyd Wright. He didn't design this building, but this prairie style is the first uniquely American style of architecture, and it was invented right here in Chicago. Now this building, what used to be the warehouses for Montgomery Ward, is multi-use today. Lots of different things going on in this building, but one of its biggest residents is Groupon. And when Groupon moved in, they found something strange. Boxes and boxes of hundreds and hundreds of roller skates. They were trying to figure out what was going on. Well, it turned out part of your uniform for the old Montgomery Ward warehouse was a pair of roller skates so you could more efficiently travel up and down these amazingly long hallways. Now, you might have noticed we just did our first turnaround here on the north branch of the river. We're going to take a little break. Hydrated. I'm already on my second can of water here, so make sure you're keeping hydrated. It is a hot one. Now, as we're coming back in towards Wolf Point, you might have noticed by this point on the tour, we go under a lot of bridges, right? These are all movable bridges. They could raise and lower to allow for larger boats to pass underneath them. They all have these pilot houses on the side. You might have seen some of them as you've gone by. You've seen some strange little buildings next to the bridges. That's a pilot house where they operate a small motor that shifts the weight between two objects. Most of the bridges, they have the bridge and then there's a counterweight, and it's the weight of the objects that does most of the work. If that's hard for you to imagine, that's why we're happy we have this bridge right here. This is what the bridges look like when they're up. That's a pilot house right there. There's another pilot house on the side right there. And this one, you can see the big slab of concrete in the back. That's the counterweight. Now this bridge is no longer in service. This one used to service the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper. Again, for you younger folks, newspapers, they used to make you pay for yesterday's news. Ask your parents about it. But as we come back towards Wolf Point, you know, no one's quite sure where that name for this part of the river came from, Wolf Point. There's some myths about it. One story goes that there was an indigenous person by the name of the Wolf that used to live around here, so they called it Wolf Point after him. Another story goes that there were wolves that used to congregate on this part of the river. Now the third story we know to be true, we just don't know which came first, is that this used to be the city center for Chicago because there were 3 taverns built around it. One was right here, one was across the way there, and then a third one was over here with a painting of a wolf over the front door. We just don't know which came first, the name Wolf Point or the painting. But I point those stories out to you because they're a great example of what the city was like back in the very beginning. We were originally a fur trading outpost, right? A frontier town. When we incorporated as a city back in 1837, there were about 3,000 people living here. That's all you needed to count as a city back in 1837. We've grown a little bit since then. Take a look around, right? Close to 3 million people living in the Chicagoland area today. Now over on the right, I told you about the train line that goes underneath this building. That train line continues behind 150 North Riverside. That's why there's a setback at the base of the building to make room for the train line. And then the city mandates a 30-foot setback from the river these days, so the base of this building looks like a pencil standing on its point, which can be a little concerning given the height of the building, right? Nothing to worry about. It's very structurally strong. But I am going to share with you folks today some techniques that builders use to build these really tall buildings here in this very windy city. Now, you probably heard this already. A lot of times these buildings are built to sway in the wind. That alleviates a lot of wind pressure on the building. If the building can sway, that's good for the building. Not fun for the people inside. You can get seasick in a building like that, right? So to compensate for it, sometimes they put giant tanks of water in the tops of the buildings. This building has around 200,000 gallons of water built into the top of it. When the building sways in the wind, all that water sloshes, and the weight of the water pulls the building back towards center quicker. If it overcompensates, it sloshes again, pulling the building back towards center. They're called inertial slosh dampeners, and that's the first of 3 techniques we're going to talk about today for building really tall buildings in this very windy city. Now, coming into view here on our left, another new addition to the skyline. This is the 2020 Bank of America building. But this is another great example of respecting our architectural heritage. The building that was here before, from the 1950s, had these wavy silver panels on the side. When they tore down the old building, they saved those wavy silver panels. If you take a look at the base of the building, you'll see the wavy silver panels down there. They're just a decorative detail, but it's a nice tip of the hat to the history of architecture here on the river. Now, speaking of the history of architecture on the river, the next section we're coming into, we call our evolution of architecture. 5 buildings on the right, built in chronological order. And as we go through them one by one, we can see how architecture has evolved here in Chicago. Starting off with this building here, soaring vertical lines, setbacks at the top. Again, it's that optimistic Art Deco style, like we talked about at the Merchandise Mart from the Roaring 20s. But when you think about the 30s, followed by World War II, not a lot of buildings being built, right? It's not till the 1950s that architecture gets a reboot. Take a look at the next 2 buildings on the right. 2 words probably come to mind: black boxes. That's sometimes what they call this style of architecture, black box modernism. Now, Mies van der Rohe is the name of the architect most closely associated with this style. Born in Germany, fled to the United States right before World War II, started teaching architecture here. So he became arguably the most influential architect of the 20th century. Famous for saying, less is more. You might have heard of that before, right? What does that mean? Well, let's look at the buildings, right? No decorative details, no gargoyles. Instead, you see what the building is made out of: metal and glass, right? It's supposed to be an elegant style of architecture, more honest, like a simple black dress. Now, this stays popular throughout the 50s and the 60s. It's not till the 1970s that we see even a slight change. Take a look at the next building on our right. Not much has changed. We've gone from black boxes to white boxes. This is called the International style from the 1970s. The idea here is this is the type of building you can put anywhere in the world and it'll fit right in, because it doesn't have much to do with the space around it. And after 3 decades of boxy buildings that have nothing to do with the space that they're in, people start to get tired of this style of architecture. Looking around the boat, some of you seem pretty tired of it already. So let's take a look at the final building in our evolution from the 1980s. Take a look at the next building down the river. You'll see it's covered in reflective glass. What does the reflective glass do? Well, it shows off the neighbors, right? It's not just about the building anymore, it's about the space around it. Look at the color of the glass. It's very similar to the color of the river. As the river curves, the building curves along with it. Why? It's trying to look good in context. That contextualism that we talked about earlier starts in the 1980s. So to review, we started off with Art Deco in the Roaring 20s, then black boxes turned into white boxes, until we were thinking outside the box with contextualism by the 1980s. Does that make sense? Give me a thumbs up if you're following along. Great. you'll be all set for our quiz later. Now, we used to not talk about this building on our left until they added this artwork to the side. See the little orange brick there? That's not all there is to it. See the lines behind it? Remember the Y shape in the river? Take a look at the Y shape at the top. It's a map of the river. That orange brick is this building. It's a You Are Here map. Really helpful for anybody who gets lost, right? You can jump in the water, swim over, figure out where you are. Now, the next building we're going to take a look at, a lot of amazing movies made here in Chicago. You might remember the Dark Knight movie, right? Christian Bale is Batman, right? At the start of the film, Heath Ledger is the Joker and his goons. They bust out a window and zip line across to the roof of Gotham Bank. Well, guess what? This is the building they bust the window out of because there it is. That's Gotham Bank from the start of the film. It's actually our old post office. I always imagined the Joker must have been so upset when he opened up his bags of cash and just found all those old Montgomery Ward catalogs, right? But there really is a connection between that big Montgomery Ward warehouse and our enormous post office here from the Roaring 20s, right? Sorry for the line. You see, back when we were the center for catalog companies, we needed an enormous post office. Once those catalog companies shut their doors, well, we shut the doors on our giant post office as well. This building sat empty for about 2 decades. But this is one of the most amazing examples of adaptive reuse. They put around $800 million into this building to turn it into state-of-the-art office space. So today, some of the largest companies in Chicago, Uber, Walgreens, PepsiCo, just to name a few, all work out of our old post office. And one of the most remarkable features of this building is an enormous rooftop park. There are running trails up there, walking paths, multiple basketball courts, tennis courts where people are playing pickleball today. Inside the building, there are state-of-the-art fitness centers with full-size boxing rings, and then they have a food court in there, some of Chicago's finest restaurants. And those are just some of the amenities that you have to provide to your employees to get them to come back to work after COVID. And I know it sounds like a joke, but I'm being serious because when it comes to high-end office space, it's still pretty well occupied. But when it comes to older office space, not just here in Chicago, but around the world, it's all sitting at about 20% vacant, and that number is increasing as we continue to discuss how people are going to come back to work after a pandemic. So what we're about to do is we are going to head way down south on this branch of the river. We're going to turn around down in Chinatown, and then we're going to come back up the river so that we can give you some of the better views of the city as we travel north. Now, as we head south, I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to share with all of you the origin story of Chicago. It's a story of how we ended up with the city you see before you here today, and it's a story in 3 parts. Now, the first part of this story starts about 150 years ago when we had a horrible disaster here, which might have been the best thing that ever happened to our city. Nod your head for me, folks, if you've ever heard of the Great Chicago Fire. You of you, yeah. So, October 8th, 1871. It was an unseasonable cow. Remember, the fire began near her barn. They said that her cow kicked over a lantern, and that's what burned down the entire city of Chicago. Let's think about that critically here today, shall we? Let's see, 1871, poor immigrant woman's animal. Do you think they were looking for somebody to blame? Maybe a escaped cow? Would you like to hear the real cause of the Great Chicago Fire?
Yeah.
Okay, 4 of you, but that's fine, I'll tell you. All right, I told you the city started off 1837, 3,000 people living here. The fire about 30 years later. You can see both events in your lifetime. Here's how many people are living in Chicago the year of the fire. 300,000. Imagine during your lifetime, your city grows from 3,000 to 300,000. This is the fastest growing city in the world at that time, and shows up? Woods, right? So what are the buildings made out of? Wood. What are the streets made out of? Wood. What are the sidewalks made out of? Wood. And if you want to open up a lumber yard next to a turpentine factory across the street from an orphanage, no one's going to stop you. Very loose zoning laws is what I'm trying to say, right? So when a small fire breaks out on the south side of the city and the entire city burns down, is that some poor immigrant woman's cow's fault or bad city planning, right? That was the cause of the Great Chicago Fire. But like I told you, probably the best thing that ever happened to us. Why? Because a certain type of person comes to Chicago after the fire. Architects descend on this city and they start to rebuild before the ground's even cooled off. By 1880, less than 10 years after the fire, the population of Chicago up to 500,000. We come back stronger from that fire. By 1885, one of these architects says, you know, maybe wood's not the best building material. Maybe we should try something else. What about a steel structure? We could build taller that way. They invent the world's first skyscraper right here. Arguably a direct result of that fire. So you see, folks, if it wasn't for the fire, I wouldn't have a tour to show you here today. We would be spending this quality time together. And wouldn't that be the real tragedy? I think so. So that's the first part of our story. That's how the city comes back stronger after the fire. We're going to get to the other two parts in just a moment, but before we do that, I want to point out the distinct lack of anything to see to our left. So you'll see there are some signs out here in the bush that say 78 Chicago. Here comes the 78. They did a survey of the city. They figured out we have about 77 neighborhoods in Chicago. So they named this development project the 78. Plan is they're going to fill in this whole section of the river. They're going to connect downtown all the way to Chinatown. The river walk will get extended down here. There will be parkland, places to work, places to play. College campuses are collaborating on learning spaces that they're going to share here in the 78. But they said recently that it's projected not to be finished until 2040. So you really are looking at the future of Chicago when you look here to the left. Now stepping from the future back to the past, when last we left off, bumps. Number one, no new styles of architecture. Why? Well, it's a design solution. You get the job done quicker if you're just copying what came before. They were all classical style buildings. Next style, there are things that we've accomplished since. So if you've been to our museum campus, Buckingham Fountain, Navy Pier, the Riverwalk, which we didn't get around to the early 2000s, those are all on the 1909 plan for Chicago. So you see, that's the third part of our origin story. We're a city that comes back stronger after the fire, a world-class city after the fair, but it's with beauty as a guiding star that you end up with the city you see before you here today. That's our origin story. Now, as you can see, we're doing another turnaround here on the south branch of the river. Really cool movable bridge coming to view here on our right. This is a vertical lift bridge. That bridge travels up and down those towers. There are counterweights up at the top. There's a pilot house on the back. Used to be operated from the pilot house, but it's been automated now, so they operate it down next to the bridge. But it's still in service to this day. There are times where you'll see that bridge going up and down. And then over to our right, you probably notice the northern edge of our Chinatown. This is King Tom Park, back in the 1950s. remember, Bertrand Goldberg, social scientist, changing where people live, right? Still ahead of the curve. Now, straight in front of us, we have for you an architectural fairy tale. The king and the queen of our skyline. That tall, dark, and handsome fella, that is the undisputed king of the Chicago skyline. We've got a lot to talk about with that building, so we're going to come back to it. In front of the king, you can see the queen, that building with those cylinder shapes on top. Looks like a queen's crown or a chess piece. You might move around on a chessboard. That building from the 1990s, those cylinders on the top were so bright. They light up at night. They were so bright when the building first opened. It was confusing migratory birds. They thought it was the moon and they were getting lost. So now they dimmed the lights on that building during migration season. Now a king and a queen, that would be good enough for most cities, but here in Chicago, we'll do even better than that. We also have a goddess as part of our skyline. Over here on the right, that silver statue on top of that building, soaring vertical lines and setbacks, let you know Art Deco building. That's an Art Deco statue of Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture. Which begs the question, why are we building statues to Roman goddesses in Chicago in the roaring 20s? Well, you gotta remember, this was the heartland of the United States back then. All of the farmers around here bringing all their goods into Chicago to be bought and sold at our stock exchange, right? You want the blessing of the goddess of agriculture over your board of trade. That's what that building is, Ceres. That's where the word cereal or cerveza comes from. Now coming back over to the undisputed king of the Chicago skyline, this tall, dark, and handsome fella, that is of course the magnificent Sears Tower. It's also the magnificent Willis Tower. We'll talk about the confusion with the name here in just a moment. This is the tallest building in Chicago. However, it was the tallest building in the world when it first opened in 1974, and it held on to that title for over 20 years. That's a long time to hold on to that title. And the way that it did it is our second technique for building really tall buildings here in this very windy city. You see, the Sears Tower is actually 9 towers bundled together. If you can see it from above, it's on a 3x3 grid. All of the spots on that grid has its own tower. All of the smaller towers add support to the 2 tallest towers. Bundling. It's a frustratingly simple concept, but that's how they built the building so tall. It's how it held on to that title for so long, and it's still the standard to this day. The tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, also uses that same bundling technique. Now let's talk about the confusion with the name. When the building first opened in 1974, they called it the Sears Tower, built by Sears Roebuck Department Stores. Again, for you younger folks, department stores. You used to have to leave your house to shop. Not so popular today. Sure enough, Sears no longer in the building. A company by the name of Willis has rented out a few floors, and they also lease the naming rights. So we have a map of the city. Willis Tower. Great view of the Sears Tower here on our right. If you ask any locals, we're a little nostalgic, we're a little stubborn. We keep calling it Sears. I know it's confusing for folks from out of town. Very simple explanation. See, it's spelled Willis, it's pronounced Sears. It's as simple as that.
Sears.
It's 1,451 feet from the first open-air entrance up to the roof of the Sears Tower. That does not include the antenna. Antenna are not designed by the architect. They're considered separate machinery when it comes to measuring the heights of really tall buildings. But those antennae are still fairly tall. They're just about 300 feet tall. If it's hard for you to wrap your head around those numbers, remember the black box buildings we saw earlier? Those buildings are just about 300 feet tall. That's how tall the antennas are on top of the Sears Tower, which aren't included in the height of the building. Now, I've been saying over and over again, this windy city of Chicago, right? That's one of our nicknames. They call us the Windy City. We are a fairly windy city, but that's not where the nickname comes from. that it came from that 1893 World's Fair. Lots of other cities were competing for the fair. Some of them accused us of exaggerating what we were going to do. They wrote in the newspaper that windy city of Chicago, meaning we were full of hot air. We don't mind. We have lots of other nicknames. Second City is another one. We used to be second biggest in population here in the U.S. We're now third, but we're also the second city we rebuilt after the fire. I told you about Hog Butcher to the World. That's one of my favorites. City of Big Shoulders, city that works. We're a very hard-working blue-collar town. Chi-Town for short. Siberia when it gets real cold here. But how about the name Chicago? Where did that come from? Well, we have the indigenous people that were here before us to thank for that. Think back to when this was all swampland. There were these onions that grew along the banks of the river, and the onions stunk. And the indigenous people here had a name for these onions. They called them Chicagoa, and that became the name for the whole region. So New York is the Big Apple, and Chicago is the stinky onion. That's what our name means. And we don't mind. We will put onions on almost anything here in Chicago. I'd like to share with you folks some tips on some food you might want to try while you're in town. Yes. Chicago, one of the only cities in the world where people line up on the street to buy popcorn. If you've heard of Garrett's, they have the unofficial Chicago mix. Caramel corn and cheddar cheese. If you haven't tried it, give it a shot. You need to dye your fingers orange. And we don't shy away from messy food here in Chicago. If you've heard about our Italian beef sandwiches, very thinly sliced beef, they cook it in this juice. So when you order it, they take these tongs, pull the beef out of the juice, and they serve it to you on a hard roll. Now you can eat it dry as is, but if you're local, you'll order it dipped, which is where they take the whole sandwich roll and all and submerge it in that juice. They wrap it in aluminum foil, hand it to you. There's not even a place to sit down in most of these restaurants, just a counter where you unwrap your sandwich. And here's the key. You put your elbows up. Why? Because you gotta lean back so it doesn't get all over your shirt as you shove the sandwich in your mouth. That's how you eat the Italian beef. Speaking of Italian food, you probably heard about our deep dish pizza, right? Lots of different styles. Giordano's, Pizzeria Uno. My personal favorite is called Lou Malnati's. L-O-U Malnati's. Anybody like sausage on top of their pizza? Show of hands. How does wall-to-wall sausage sound? That's how they serve it at Lou's. Just a hubcap of meat sitting on top of that pie. If that sounds good to you, they have one at the base of the Wrigley building right when we drop you off on our tour. But I have saved the best for last, and that is, of course, the Chicago style hot dog. We take our hot dogs very seriously here in Chicago. We're visiting Maxwell Street, which is an old Jewish neighborhood. So they're always all beef, no pork in our dogs. And just like a bagel covered with poppy seeds, the bun on a Chicago dog should be covered in poppy seeds. If you unwrap your dog, you don't see little black dots on it, you don't want it. Walk right out. And like I told you, Chicago is a city in a garden. Well, a Chicago-style hot dog, we call it drug through the garden. Why? This is what we put on a Chicago dog. Onions, tomatoes, relish, pickle spear, sport peppers, celery, salt, and mustard. There's only one thing we don't put on a Chicago-style hot dog, and that's ketchup! You will catch hands if you ask for ketchup. Skip it while you're in town. The bottle's waiting for you at home. Now, as we come back to Wolf Point, as promised, we have our first quiz. Over here on the right is the new Bing building from the 1980s. Now, I'm going to describe the building to all of you, then I'll give you multiple choice on the style of architecture. All you need to do is raise your hand with the number that you think is right. Are you ready? Well, we're going to do it anyway. The new Bing building from the 1980s, covered in reflective glass. The reflective glass showing off to neighbors. The color of the glass very similar to the color of the river. As the river curves, the building curves along with it. Why? It's trying to look good in context. What do we call that style of architecture? Is it 1, Art Deco? Is it 2, contextualism? Or is it 3, black box modernism? Raise your hand with the number that you think is right. Give me those peace signs, you hippies. Yes, it is 2! Look at that. You learned something against your will on a boat today. Nicely done. All right, you did so well with that. Let's try another. Here in Chicago, we have a lot of public art. In Millennium Park, we have a piece of public art officially called Cloud Gate, but nobody in Chicago calls it that. We all call it the Beam. The Beam, that's right. Fun fact about the Beam, the artist who designed it hates that we call it that. So keep it up, everybody. Nicely done. Here's another piece of public art for you. The merchandise, Mark. What am I talking about? On the other side of the river, there's this big black box full of projectors. If you come down here after dark, they project art onto the surface of the merchandise, Mark. It's a free public art program. They feature different artists throughout the year, and they call it, get this, Art on the Mart. Give that guy a raise, whoever came up with that one. You got the big black box full of projectors, then you'll see these green boxes down in the water full of plants. Those plants are there to provide fish a space to spawn and raise their young. They're called fish hotels. Back in the 1970s, they tested the river. We had about 10 species of fish living here. They checked again recently. We have close to 80. So it's a great example of how the river is getting cleaner and healthier. And just this year, there's a new story about the kayakers that are down here on the river. They've been spotting this same enormous snapping turtle sunning itself on rusted chains down in the water. They've seen it so often they have a nickname for it. Now they call it Chonkosaurus. And scientists have said if the turtle's gotten that big, that's another sign that the river is getting pretty healthy. Now here's another example of adaptive reuse. On our left, this building from the 1910s. But as we come out on the other side, today it's got commercial space inside of it, a restaurant, classrooms. But I want you to find the clock in the center of the building and then count along with me the banks of windows on each side. You'll see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on this side of the clock tower. On the other side, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whoop, 6. That's a lopsided building. What's going on here? Well, when they built the LaSalle Street Bridge, they had to widen the street. To do so, they cut off a chunk of this building and rebuilt it so you wouldn't notice. You see, folks, this is why you go on these tours, right? All of us, we know what's up. Look at those people over there. Not a clue, right? Now take a look at the building here with the 55 on, another style of architecture we haven't talked about yet. Looks like an angry little fortress, right? We have a nickname for this building. We call it the Danny DeVito building. You can probably see why. But let's look at the details. Concrete on the surface, deep set windows, kind of an intimidating architecture. This is called brutalism from the late 1960s. A lot of social upheaval in the U.S. at that time, so they wanted an intimidating style of architecture. A lot of government buildings and college campuses from the late 1960s built in the brutalist style. Now as we come out from underneath the bridge, we're going to have our first I Spy of the tour. Take a look at the skyline, see if you can find a building that looks like a green glass champagne bottle with gold foil around the neck. If you see it, point at it so everybody can find it. Yeah, over on the right, the carbide and carbon building. Soaring vertical lines and setbacks let you know Art Deco building. You know the style, you know when it's from, the Roaring 20s. What's going on in Chicago? Prohibition. Want to see how he felt about not drinking alcohol in Chicago? Look at the building that looks like a champagne bottle. Tells you everything you need to know. Now straight in front of us you'll see 4 buildings built right next to each other. We haven't seen that really on our tour. A lot of other cities build this way, where the buildings take up all the available real estate. Imagine you're walking down the street and all the buildings are pressing in on you like that. How does that make you feel? Might make you feel a little anxious, right? Like there's no room for you. We'll take a look around. You'll see that's not usually how we build here in Chicago. There's a lot of room to breathe around our buildings. A lot of folks come here, they'll say for such a big city, Chicago feels pretty laid back. And I would suggest to you, it's our architecture that makes people feel that way, right? When there's room to breathe around the buildings, it feels like there's room for you. Architects can change the way you feel about a space that you're in. So since we're out here on the river with all this room to breathe, let's all take a nice deep breath together. What do you guys say? Ready? Here we go. How's everybody feeling? You guys having a good time? Yes. I'm having a great time with you. I know some of you are taking a look at where we dock over here thinking to yourself, oh no, the tour's almost over. Not today. I talked to the captain. We're going all the way out towards the lake. What do you guys say?
Let's do this!
We do it every tour. Now, probably my favorite building on the river here on our left. This is the Wrigley Building. That's a name you'll see all over town. Wrigley Field, Wrigley Chewing Gum. That's all bubble gum money you're looking at there from the early 1920s. This building trying to look like a cathedral in Spain, so they call it the Spanish Revival style. Across the street, Tribune Tower, top of that building trying to look like a French Gothic cathedral. In between the two Revival style buildings, you see soaring vertical lines and setbacks, Art Deco building, but an onion dome on the top. That's the Intercontinental Hotel today. It used to be the headquarters for the Shriners, a men's group that like Turkish details. That's why they put an onion on top of their building. We found the onion. Now here's the Apple, our little Apple store with the see-through walls. We talk about subliminal marketing. Look at that iPad for a roof. You didn't even know you wanted one until you walked into the place, right? You found the Apple. Can you find the Peacock? Over here, NBC Tower, right? Trying to look like Rockefeller Center in New York. Rockefeller Center, beautiful Art Deco building. We built ours in 1989. That doesn't count as Art Deco. So if you're copying that Art Deco style, they call this Eco Deco. Now, take a look down this alleyway here on our left. You'll see a black building with white antenna on the top. We don't get a great view of it, but it is an important building. That's the John Hancock building. Used to be the tallest building in Chicago. It's the 5th tallest now. I pointed out because it has an observation deck up at the top where you pay for beautiful views of the city. Well, they also have a bar up there. It's called the Signature Room. The bar is free. Take the money you save, not go into the observation deck, go up to the Signature Room, buy yourself an expensive cocktail, and get the same view. That's a pro tip from your old pal Sparrow. Over here on the right, take a look at the brown building with the stripe on it. We don't care about it. Look at the one behind it. See all those wavy lines? That's Aqua Tower from 2009. Those wavy lines are patios designed that way so it looks like water's flowing up and down the surface of the building. It's a selling point for Aqua Tower, right? Designed by a superstar architect, her name, Jeannie Gang. Jeannie Gang, born and raised in the Midwest, went off to Harvard, won a MacArthur Genius Grant, and in 2021 came back to Chicago and built the 3rd tallest building in the city. That's the St. Regis. Just like that, we've seen the top 3 tallest buildings in the city. Sears or Willis, number 1. Trump is number 2. And number 3 is the St. Regis. However, this is the tallest building in the world, designed by a female-led architectural firm. So we're very proud of that. Yeah, give it up for that. Changing face of architecture on display right here in Chicago. And this building has all 3 techniques we're going to talk about today for building really tall buildings in this very windy city. Up in that tallest tower, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. As the building sways in the wind, the water sloshes. Those inertial slosh dampeners. Then, remember that bundling technique we talked about with the Sears Tower. We'll look at the stair steps of St. Regis. Each of those smaller towers adding support to that tallest tower. But here's the one we haven't talked about yet. Up at the 83rd, 84th floor of the building, that cross shape up there, you might have noticed, you can look right through it. That's because there's no walls, there's no windows up there. Those are blow-through floors. If you want to alleviate some of the wind pressure on the building, let the wind blow right through, right? It's a great design solution, but it's also surprisingly expensive. Why? Recently, 2 floors of this building sold for $13 million. And it turns out you can't sell floors of a building that don't have walls or windows. But that's what you have to do if you want to build these really tall buildings here in this very windy city. Now coming into view over on our left, another iconic building. This is Lake Point Tower from the 1960s, high-end condominium. Great views of the city and the lake can be had from Lake Point Tower. But as we get closer and closer to the building, you might start to feel sad for it. Because it's all alone out there. Don't. That building's a cheater. It's not supposed to be out there. Remember, the lakefront's supposed to be free and clear for all Chicagoans. No private property. Remember Aaron Montgomery Ward? Well, in the 1960s, the people that built Lake Point Tower, they found a little loophole in that law. Whoop, out popped Lake Point Tower. Since then, we've closed that loophole, and now it's out there by itself. It's in timeout thinking about what it did, all right? Don't talk to it. But it does bring up one of the greatest features of our city, which we're heading on to right now, which is our lakefront. Over 17 miles of uninterrupted, totally public lakefront property. Free use for anyone, whether you live here, whether you're just visiting. One of the most popular things to do on the lakefront is to head out to Navy Pier. A lot of fun things to do
Maybe we should go Navy Pier.
Right, the
还没有，
Ferris
还没有带你去过。
wheel.
下次怎么没有带宝贝去
Ferris
呢？
wheel debuted here in Chicago as part of that 1893 World's Fair. It wasn't originally here, it was about 10 miles south of here, down in Hyde Park, but that first Ferris wheel, it was about 60 feet taller than the one that you see out here today. More impressive than that, every one of the cars on that first Ferris wheel about the size of a train car. Each car held 61 people each. That 61st person was a bartender. Every one of those cars had its own bar. Probably because you need a little bit of liquid encouragement to get on the world's first Ferris wheel. Now what we're about to do is do our own turnaround out here near the lake. As we do, this is last call for our bar. If you want to get one more beverage, now's the time for it. But we do ask that you finish up any of your alcohol. It is also last call for our restrooms. The restrooms will be closed when we dock, so if you have to head to the head, now's the time for that. We're going to do another turnaround out here near the lake. It's a great time to get another photograph of the skyline. As we do, I'm going to step away from the mic. If you have any questions for me, feel free to come up and ask. Once we turn all the way around, I'll get back on the mic and we'll finish up our tour. I'll see you all then.
This is the best view.
This one,
Yeah, this is the best. You can see all the... 好漂亮。Can take me a photo here.
啊，
Can take a photo here.
我们两个 take a photo 这样。
Yeah.
Is our lakefront. Over 17 miles of uninterrupted, totally public lakefront property. Free use for anyone, whether you live here, whether you're just visiting. One of the most popular things to do on the lakefront is to head out to Navy Pier. A lot of fun things to do.
Maybe we should go Navy Pier.
Right, the
还没有，
Ferris wheel.
还没有带你去过。下次怎么没有带宝贝去
Ferris
呢？
wheel debuted here in Chicago as part of that 1893 World's Fair. It wasn't originally here, it was about 10 miles south of here, down in Hyde Park, but that first Ferris wheel, it was about 60 feet taller than the one that you see out here today. More impressive than that, every one of the cars on that first Ferris wheel about the size of a train car. Each car held 61 people each. That 61st person was a bartender. Every one of those cars had its own bar. Probably because you need a little bit of liquid encouragement to get on the world's first Ferris wheel. Now what we're about to do is do our own turnaround out here near the lake. As we do, this is last call for our bar. If you want to get one more beverage, now's the time for it. But we do ask that you finish up any of your alcohol. It is also last call for our restrooms. The restrooms will be closed when we dock, so if you have to head to the head, now's the time for that. We're going to do another turnaround out here near the lake. It's a great time to get another photograph of the skyline. As we do, I'm going to step away from the mic. If you have any questions for me, feel free to come up and ask. Once we turn all the way around, I'll get back on the mic and we'll finish up our tour. I'll see you all then.
This is the best view.
This one,
Yeah, this is the best. You can see all the... 好漂亮。Can take me a photo here.
啊，
Can take a photo here.
我们两个 take a photo 这样。
Yeah.
Blacks in the ground that'll show you the footprint of the old Fort Dearborn. It wasn't there for very long, built right around 1800. It was destroyed in a war right around 1812. Anybody know the name of the war? War of 1812. We've been doing it this way the whole tour, right? So if you can remember the 4 F's, the